great pleasure to introduce Björklund, who's professor of economics at SOFI, who I'm also very proud and happy to call my co-author, and so far at least one paper. It's always a sort of something you think about when you want to introduce someone and you want to somehow reflect years and years of important work and to somehow, give a flavor of what has this person done, why is he giving keynote here. I happen to know that Anders has a particular inclination in terms of how you should think of one's research, what is important in your research, and that has to do with citations. So I will just give you his most cited papers. And I think when I looked at them myself, I think that they reflect pretty well, what he's worked on, pretty broad range of labor and family economics issues, and in particular intergenerational mobility aspects that he's talking about here. So first, there's something that we talked about yesterday, has to do with the gender wage gap and gender effect. So is there a glass ceiling in Sweden? Journal of Labor Economics, most cited paper, together with Jim Albrecht and Susan Robin. The second also came up yesterday in different ways, sort of methodological, conceptual paper with great importance for many practical problems we might face, and that's together with Robert Moffat, estimation of wage gains and welfare gains from self-selection models. That must be like one of your first papers or something. It's from the late 80s, still important. Then there's the intergenerational income mobility in Sweden compared to the US. This, in my mind, is one of the most important papers in this whole literature, or at least it started a change in terms of how people thought about intergenerational mobility aspects, and in particular comparing the US and Sweden, or the US and Europe more broadly. The fourth one, let's take that as well, because it touches on today's talk. The origins of intergenerational associations, lessons from Swedish adoption data in the QJ a couple of years ago. So all of these things reflect Anders' research, and I'm looking very much forward to hearing your thoughts on 4 approaches to thinking about intergenerational mobility. So, please, Anders.
Thanks a lot, Jesper. For this type of presentation, and I'm actually also working on a paper like this. It's twofold, I would say. The first is academic, that we have 4 subfields that, in my view, have much to learn from each other, but are quite separated. It's striking how people who actually work on quite closely related topics actually ignore each other, and I'm a bit annoyed by that fact in this field. I also want to address the question whether research today really focuses on the most important issues, and I think it doesn't in some respect. But I think there's also very serious public policy motivation for this comparison of 4 approaches, because I think that in the end, of course, we want to know the impact of policies on different outcomes, like Tarje talked about yesterday, but at an early stage we want to have a notion of whether family background is very important for the outcomes that we care about, or only somewhat important. And I think that's important and to know and center at the very early stage. And I would say that some of the approaches here suggest that family background is only somewhat important. Whereas other approaches actually suggest that it's very, very important. So I think we have to get a clear view about this. And therefore, I think it's important to confront these approaches to each other. My roadmap is very simple here. I have the 4 approaches. I will explain them and give the main findings. And then in the conclusions, I will address what the literature can learn from each other and in what direction I think research should go. Now when I cover 4 approaches, my presentation might make a very comprehensive impression that I cover more or less everything, but that's actually not the case. And there are 2 things I want to say here. First, there is also in this literature a more structural approach that is associated with Jim Heckman. And in this approach, they try to identify and estimate sort of a parental production function that has input like money and time and other resources, and parents have to use this production function, and sometimes they are credit constrained and sometimes not, and so on, and then you get results out of that. I think that is a very important approach as well, but I don't mention that at all. I'm actually going to give this speech in Chicago 2 months from now, and then I think I have to fine-tune my presentation a little bit because the conference is by Jim Heckman. I also want to say that I don't consider social mobility. And by social mobility, I mean class mobility in sociology, because class is really a social concept, because class is defined according to how people are related to each other. So I think that literature deserves to be called social mobility. I will talk about what economists have been working on now for, say, 20 years, and that is long-run income or long-run earnings. Whether you use income or earnings depends a bit on what data you have, but it's also common to use years of education. So I will talk about education mobility and economic mobility, and not social mobility. That I think is something else, and actually a very fascinating field of research, full of perspectives in many ways. So then I have my first approach here, which I will be very brief about, because I think this is very well known. So I will mainly have this as a background to the other fields, to the comparison with the other fields. The prototypical model here is that you have on the left-hand side the outcome of an offspring, in general a son, and it's in general long-run, the log of long-run income that you use, and on the right-hand side you have the father. Of course, one would also like to have daughters and mothers and so on, but given the time periods that are analyzed and the data that are available, it's much easier to do studies for sons and fathers. So this very simple equation is the starting point and the prototypical model, and it is really a regression toward the mean type of equation. So if you have the log of outcomes and you have a beta of like 0.5, it means that a 10% differential on parental side is transmitted to a 5% differential on the offspring side. So that's what it is. So since it's the logarithm of income that is used is elasticity. One could also be interested in the correlation, and then you sort of standardize income on both sides and you get the correlation instead. This seems extremely straightforward. Actually, there are lots of small tricky issues involved in estimating this, but that's not what I want to talk about today. I should of course also say that in this literature there are some people who look at non-linearities in this relationship. It has become more and more common to use rank correlations, the rank of income, and also sometimes transition matrices. But that's not related to the questions I'm going to address today. So I simply mentioned that we have such results as well. So what are the main lessons from this literature that I think now is about 20-25 years among economists? I have decided to summarize the results with a curve that has been named the Great Gatsby curve. But let me first explain what it is. On the vertical axis, it is the intergenerational elasticity. And you can see that it goes from like 0.15 up to 0.5. So that's the range of the elasticities from somewhat below 0.2 up to 0.5. That can be quite easily interpreted in the way that I just did. On the horizontal axis, it's cross-sectional inequality of the type that Branko talked about yesterday in the parent generation. And here the results are shown in that way. And what is interesting is that there seems to be a positive relationship. The exact reason why it looks like that can be discussed. There's no really good explanation, I would say, but that is how it looks. So the order of magnitude here is about 0.2 to 0.5. And we have this pattern when we compare countries. One can really also ask why it's called the Great Gatsby curve. It was named that way by Alan Kruger initially when he worked for President Obama, and President Obama also used this concept, and it received a lot of attention. It would take too much time to explain why it's called the Great Gatsby curve. The purpose was, of course, to get attention, and in that respect they were very, very successful. Having said that these are the main results, I should actually also confess that I am personally a bit dissatisfied with the quality of estimates that are entered here, especially on intergenerational elasticities. But I would be very surprised if the slope would disappear with better estimates. So there are also some results for years of schooling, less well known, and the order of magnitude here we have both coefficients and correlations, and the order of magnitudes here are a bit higher, like 0.3, 0.4, 0.46 for the US, 0.4 for Sweden. And here the differences between Sweden and the US are not that big, and I think the reason is that the income elasticities also capture the differences in returns to schooling, for example. So I think that there is no contradiction here. So that's the magnitudes that we have, and so what are the conclusions here? Very brief about this. I think that we have learned some about country differences that have been very provocative to the profession and also to policy discussion. But here I think it's important to say that the associations are not that strong in my view. correlations are probably in the same range as elasticities. It would be surprising if they are very different. So I would argue that they are close to that. It might be actually that the high US number is a little bit lower for correlation. And for such comparisons, I think that correlations are a bit better, but we don't have them for specific reasons. But if you accept that these are also correlations, the R squares will be from like 4 to 25%. A correlation of 0.2 gives you 4%, and a correlation of 0.5, 25%. So that's the explanatory power of this. And I would say that these associations are not extremely strong. And if someone would say that more or less we have eliminated the importance of at least this type of family background. If someone would say that, I think it's hard to argue against. But of course one can also say this type of family background still matters in some sense, and we should seriously consider all policies that can have an impact and consider them seriously. So I think it's often forgotten that these associations are not extremely strong and in a sense quite weak. And the one reason also I stress that is that in popular presentations, these associations are often described as more or less deterministic. That if you have a wealthy parents in terms of income, then you will also be wealthy yourself. Maybe it's close to deterministic in the very top of the distribution, because there the association seems to be stronger. But if you look at it in a general way, I don't think that the associations are very strong, and they are definitely far from being deterministic. Some authors have also presented scatter plots of the associations, and they also reveal a lot of ability. Since I haven't done that myself, I am not presenting it. So this is a very brief introduction to intergeneration mobility, and I'm going to contrast that now with the other approaches. Intergeneration effects, what does that mean? That means that you ask what are the causal effects of thought interventions that change parents' income or education. So then you have in mind some kind of policy that changes income of parents or education of parents. What will in that case something happen with the children? Is there a causal effect? And that is of course a different question. And it's different from intergenerational mobility that more wants to describe how society looks. I'm going to argue that both are relevant, but it's an important difference here. Intergenerational effects, here the prototypical model is different, and it always has both the father and the mother, and that's quite important to stress. Especially when it comes to education, it's a big issue what parent matters most in some sense. So the model here has both. And that's also why it becomes much more difficult to talk about mobility, because here we have two variables. And there we have a growing literature that has appeared in the great journals. I would say that there are three empirical strategies to get the causal effect. One is to look at twin differences, and you look at differences between cousins who have twin parents, who have parents who are twins. So you look at you relate differences among cousins to differences among their parents who are twins. Ideally, monozygotic and self-twins. And that is, of course, a way to take some genetics and common environment out of the relationship. And if you don't have measurement error, I think at least you take some bias out by doing that. Another approach has been to use adoptive parents, which eliminates the genetic transmission if there is random assignment of the adopted children, and that doesn't seem to be the case exactly, but I don't think some results suggest that the assignment of children is not non-random enough to cause severe biases. So that sort of isolates the environmental impact of parents and has no genetic transmission at all. And there are, of course, also IV studies that use reforms of different types to give exogenous variation in parental resources. There are many studies of this, and also very good comparison of these three empirical approaches. I think we should be proud that there are such studies for Norway and Sweden, but of course also for the US. And there I mean that the data come from our countries, because I think it's good if we study our own countries. So what are the results from this approach? I would say that the estimates of the causal effects in general are in the range 0 to 60% of the intergenerational associations. So it seems as though only part of the descriptive patterns is causal. And my kind of average of this is like maybe a third of the intergenerational mobility coefficients can be considered as causal. That is, of course, quite crude, because it might be that in some contexts the causal effects can be very big, and there are some papers out there suggesting that in some contexts they can be big, but they can also in some contexts be very small. So I think it's very important to stress that if you see intergenerational mobility coefficients, don't mix them up with intergenerational effects, because it's something different. So that's a short summary of this approach. Then we come to the other ones. The sibling correlation approach. Here the idea is to consider the outcome y, which is the variable of which we want to study inequality. We want to study inequality of y, and we argue that this outcome has two components. One that is common to all siblings in a family. It's sort of the average in the family, and then there are also deviations from this average within the family, and that's the individual effects, B. And because of the fact that the individual component here captures the deviations from the means, they are by construction orthogonal. So the inequality that we are interested in is the sum of the variance of the family component and the variance of the individual components. And that happens also to be the sibling correlation. If you work out what the sibling correlation would be, you would get this expression. And it's exactly this expression, this ratio, that I think is so very useful, because it tells us what fraction of total inequality, measured as a variance, can be attributed to the common family components. Is it a large share or a small? And so it's that ratio, not the fact that it happens also to be a sibling correlation, but that ratio is very, very useful. So a sibling correlation captures more than an intergenerational correlation, and one can show the following, that the sibling correlation is the square of the intergenerational correlation plus other shared factors that are uncorrelated with the parental outcome that you studied. And here you can sort of see that the sibling correlation has like an R-square interpretation, the fraction of total variance that can be explained by something. And of course the intergeneration correlation is also an R-square. You square the correlation and get an R-square, and then you have all the other factors. So because of that, it's an omnibus, it's considered as an omnibus measure. It captures a lot. Both observed and unobserved family background and neighborhood factors. That's also important. So it's a mix of family and neighborhood. But yet it is a lower bound. Because it's a lower bound of family background and neighborhoods, because it only captures what is shared. Of course, each member of a family can be influenced a lot by the background, but in a way that is not shared with the sibling. Therefore, there is more to family background than this. And so it's a lower bound, and if a lower bound is high, it's interesting. And I think this lower bound is quite high. And here we have some estimates of routing correlations in long-run earnings. They are easier to estimate. And here you can see that the order of magnitude is between, it's low for Norway. For Sweden, we have 0.25 and 0.32, and that's two estimation techniques, and I think that the higher one is a bit more reliable, but the other ones are more comparable. So here you can also see that the US has quite a high number, although Germany is not far from. These are higher than the R-squares from the intergenerational mobility equations. So that means that there is quite much in that sibling share that is not captured by the intergenerational mobility estimates. There are also some estimates of sibling correlations in years of schooling, and they are also like 0.4, 0.5, or even 0.6, and really high for Germany, and I don't really have the explanations for that. So in terms of R-squares, now you come close to 50%, and that's much higher than what you got for intergenerational mobility. So now we are getting higher numbers for the importance of family background. So, yet they are lower bounds, and then one can ask what is missing. And of course, full siblings, these are full siblings, they have only about half of their initial genes in common, but each individual, of course, has 100% of her initial genes from the parents. So there is some genetic inheritance that is not captured by the sibling correlation that I showed. So there is more. And here I added the word initial, and that is a way to talk to those of you who are interested in epigenetics, that genes might change because of environmental changes. But I think that the impact of your initial genes is interesting, because that has a reduced form interpretation. So there could be more, and not all environmental experience or shocks are shared, only some. So some environmental stuff is also missing. And there could also be differential treatment by parents. And that will not be captured if it creates differences. So whatever impact from your family that create differences will not be captured. But it's part of family background. So these numbers that started to look quite high, should actually be even higher. So is it possible to do something? One could ask whether one could look at the associations for MZ twins, because they have identical initial genes. So that must be a good thing. They share all initial genes, so we get come closer to the true result in that way. They also share more environment and more shocks, which is very good here because we want to capture the impact of all shocks or environmental factors that a person experiences during childhood. That is, of course, good for the purpose I have here. But of course, if this would be important, it would be devastating for conventional nature-nurture decompositions. But for this purpose, it's good, actually. They might also interact more and affect each other in ways that have no counterpart in the general population. That is, of course, a weakness with drawing inference from MZ twins. So if they interact more than the population generally, because here we want to make inference about the total population, and then we cannot rely on results from people who interact in a different way than others do. So, but still one could ask whether one could raise the lower bound by... So here I have some results for MZ twins versus full siblings. And there you can see that really the numbers become really high. So if the difference here between the full sibling numbers and the MZ twin numbers really reflect genetic influence, and not the fact that MZ twins interact more, then the numbers in my view are quite scary, because that suggests that maybe 75% of all inequality that we see can be related to family background. And in general, we don't like such impact, and then we are really, and if we consider that as deviation from equality of opportunity, I'm coming to that a little bit later, then of course these are in a sense scary numbers, because this shows that there's a lot. Of course we don't know for sure. The MZ twin numbers might be too high, but I would personally be very surprised if the difference between full siblings and MZ twin siblings does not primarily capture genetic influence. But of course we cannot know. But it might be that family background is as important as that. Then you can ask how important is interaction among siblings for the family component, and there is some suggestive evidence from sibling similarity by age difference. I think one can argue that interaction is more common among closely spaced siblings. So if that is the case, sibling correlation should be higher for closely spaced siblings if interaction is very important. And in that case, it might be that MZ twins are similar because of interaction. However, closely spaced siblings are also exposed to similar shocks, and that's something that you want to capture. The impact of all shocks, whatever you want to call it, during childhood. So it's not a crystal clear test, because there could be different mechanisms. But similar sibling correlations by age difference suggest that interaction is not that important. So permanent family factors would then explain similarity instead. So I have some results where I have looked at sibling correlations by age difference, and there I have DZ twins, I have non-twins less than 4 years apart, and non-twins more than 4 years apart. And there are some differences, so the closer you are, the higher the numbers are, but I don't think that the differences are very big. So I'm not that concerned about that objection to using MZ twins for inference about the total impact of family background. There is of course also differential treatment. There could also be differential treatment among MZ twins, of course. And one very concrete example is birth order, which is impossible. Of course, differential in general is impossible to measure, but birth order is possible to measure, and there is a famous study that shows quite convincingly that firstborn do better than laterborn. So this is something that one could add and maybe that raise this lower bound for siblings. So it's possible to integrate birth order into this analysis, and one can use a dummy for firstborn and estimate within family effects for firstborn. And that's what we have done. And you have here the regression coefficient in the second column, and they are all significant. So the regression coefficient for earnings is 0.024, and that's actually something. For years of schooling, it's 0.25, and that's a quarter of a year, so that's also something. But when you consider the variance that is generated by this, yeah, so here the second column is the regression coefficient for firstborn, and they are maybe non-trivial. But if you work out how much is explained by that, you get the explanatory power from the firstborn, which is very little. So you have the variance components there in the other columns, and the family component is 21.6% for earnings and brothers, and that means that the sibling correlation is 22% in these estimations. So, and then you have the individual component, and then you can argue also that the firstborn, the contribution from being firstborn is also part of family background, although it is an individual effect. But actually, it doesn't really matter. So this type of differential treatment does not seem to be important in this perspective. Other people are very excited by birth order effects, but my conclusion is that birth order is not important, does not give an important contribution to inequality of opportunity. And if you put it that way, I think the answer is quite obvious. But in some ways, the birth order effect might be large. You can also ask how much do the IG mobility estimates explain, because we have this and this relationship that I showed. So this is actually an identity, it's not an approximation. Here I have some Swedish estimates, and here the sibling correlations are slightly different from the other slide, but in the same neighborhood. And you can see here that the part that is attributed to the intergenerational mobility coefficient is very small. It's 2% of it's 0.02 of 0.24. So the bulk is the other factors, and it's a little bit higher for schooling, but the general result is that you miss a lot of family background when you only consider intergenerational mobility. So there is much more to it that is shared by siblings. I have one extension here that one could add one more parent to the equation, but that does not change very much. So if I sum this up, I would say that the intergenerational correlations capture only very little. I have tried to be a bit provocative about that and say that those who look at intergenerational mobility, they look at the tip of the iceberg. And I'm not really sure if those I want to provoke by that or really provoke, but I have done my best. The intergeneration causal effects capture even less, and I have tried to call it, if you look at that and is excited about it, you look at the tip of the iceberg. But still, I don't think my message has reached the whole profession. But sibling correlations reveal a large role for something in the family. Unobserved factors seems to be very important. And yet sibling correlations are lower bounds. M-set twin correlations are possibly upper bounds, but not necessarily so. And they suggest a very big role for family background. Birth order effects do not account for much in this perspective. So now we have reached a situation where something in the family and neighborhood matters quite much in some respect. Then we come to the equality opportunity approach, of which we had 3 presentations yesterday, and this presentation of this approach is very brief, and the presentations yesterday were of course much more deep. But for the discussion I want to have here, I think it's this presentation is enough. The framework here is that you have the outcome that you're interested in, and you're interested in inequality or Y, and that's determined by variable C that are called circumstances, factors beyond individual control for which individuals should not be held responsible. And of course, parental resources belong to that. But of course also effort comes up, and there could be a set of effort variables, of course, in a conceptual framework like this. And that's all choices for which society holds the individual accountable. So that can, in that case, be fair inequality in a sense. I think it's important to stress here that the advocates of this approach argue that it's the reduced form that is interesting. So I have the reduced form there as well. And so consequently, if through circumstances, say family, parental resources, have an impact on your outcome via effort, that is still caused by circumstances. So even that is considered due to circumstances, and thus of a type of inequality that violates the equality of opportunity. So I think this is important to stress, and I think that this is acceptable. Maybe when I come to this approach, I should say that I'm quite weak in the philosophical part of this literature. Jesper asked me a question of that type on lunch yesterday, and he got no answer. So anyway, this is what is done, and the implementation here, I think one can show that quite simply too. You estimate the reduced form, you identify the circumstances that you have access to and that you think are reasonable, and then you measure the fraction of variance which is explained by circumstances. You can measure R squared, or rather which is preferred in this field, because in this field they are very concerned about what inequality to use. They derive the inequality according to the suitable measure of inequality that is generated by the circumstances. And then they compare this inequality with total inequality. So it's the shared inequality due to circumstances divided by total inequality that is sort of the unfair inequality. So that's a very short summary, and of course that doesn't give justice to everything that is done in this field. There are some empirical approaches that consider luck in a sense, and also some that explicitly measure effort. And I think that one of the papers yesterday also had effort in the equation. So this is a very simple description, but for the discussion I want to have here, I think it's enough. There are also other nice tricks here, and Marcus showed one of them yesterday, that you can also consider the distribution within the types that are defined by the circumstances. But still, I don't think that is necessary here. So, a first reaction from me on this literature, since I came from the other literatures when I have one paper in this field. So when I started to look at this, my reaction was immediate, that these researchers tried to fill in the gap between the intergeneration correlation and the sibling correlation. So that's how I looked at it immediately. With the sibling correlation, you have the intergeneration correlation squared, but here you also add other circumstances that you have in your data set and that are observed. Otherwise, you wouldn't have them in your data set. I'm trying to make the distinction between observed and observable. That's why I mix this up a little bit. But I have never seen anyone in the literature recognizing this, and in the sibling correlation literature, it has been recognized for a very long time that it's almost hopeless to come close to the sibling correlation by adding observed variables in an equation. So, but still, that is what people try to do in this field. So, let us look a little bit about what circumstance variables have been used and which are sort of valid ones. So, some results. A study on earnings in Brazil by Bourguignon and et al. They got R squares quite high, 0.2430, and then they also transformed the inequality into an inequality measure that satisfies the axioms that you want them to satisfy. Actually, the variance, I don't think, satisfy these axioms. So therefore, one also wants to have these other ones. So that's sort of the magnitudes, and they are, in a sense, not trivial, but we also know that Brazil is a very unequal country, so it's not that surprising. For schooling, slightly higher for Brazil, like 25–30%. Turkey, the same. And then we have Marcus and my study with John Romer, where we went very far in terms of using circumstances. We had quite detailed data from our registers, and one can claim actually that some of the circumstances are not valid ones. Parental income, I think, is no problem. Parental education, parental separation, where the parents have separated, number of siblings, IQ at age 18, and that, in my view, that is a bit too late to have, because at age 18, I think it's effort, and to some extent. If it would have been 15, I wouldn't have had any problems, but this is what we could do. And then we got inequality in terms of Gini of 24%, and other measure of 10%. And Marcus showed yesterday that when gender was taken into account and also cognitive skills, the numbers are a bit higher, but not dramatically higher, at least not for men. But still, actually, the R square of 6% here is very low compared to the sibling correlations that we get for Sweden. I'm not really sure if we recognize that in this paper, but anyway, no one in this literature recognizes that they have a benchmark for the basic equation from the sibling literature that they can use, and maybe they don't say that because it's embarrassing, they are so far from, But it seems as though those who work in this literature are not really aware of each other. Yeah, there is also another paper that it's out now actually, I should have changed that, but I actually gave a presentation like this in Germany some time ago, and the authors of this paper were there, and I said that these guys do not even show the R-square, which I want to have as a benchmark. But the day after I got in the email the R-square, so I put them in. So how do the results compare? I have already said this actually, and still actually sibling correlations are lower bounds of the importance of family background. So if you would argue that only a little bit of, say, half of the additional influence that you get from MZ twins would be there, then you're even farther from the sibling correlations. So I think there is one major problem with this approach, and that is whether the omitted variables are effort or circumstances. Because if you consider this literature, for many, the most important circumstance variables, there is also a causal effect literature that I have just presented. And so look at parental income and education that has been used in this field. Intergeneration effects are considerably lower than transmission coefficients. Then you must ask, are these omitted variables also circumstances, or are they sort of effort? And of course, the most honest answer is that we don't know. And so I also think that this literature should be related to the intergenerational effect literature. And here there's also one way to defend the use of parental income and parental education. That is, if you believe that the omitted variables that you have when you do intergenerational mobility, if that is genetics, and your genetic inheritance is a circumstance that you cannot be held accountable for, then you are fine. Then you can use it. But those who work in this field are not very inclined to point at the importance of genetics. There is also, in the parental separation literature, there is a big literature looking whether the descriptive patterns between, you have descriptive patterns showing the relationship between having a parental separation when you grow up and your outcome during adulthood. And these coefficients are much larger than the causal effects. And are these omitted variables effort to circumstance? I think we must argue that we don't really know. So I think this is a problem in this field. And in a sense, the same problems apply to sibling correlations, I would say. Are really all factors shared by siblings to be considered circumstances? I think that is a tough question, and maybe one can, to some extent, one can argue that they are. Well, the counter-argument would be that suppose that siblings interact and they develop a lot of effort. Isn't that something that is fair? But then one can also ask, have the other argument that you don't choose those with whom you interact and get a lot of effort. So, in some respects, I think that what you share with siblings is not, it's not, it is something that you cannot be held accountable for in all respects. But it might be actually that sibling correlation capture to some extent effort as well. But to find out more, we have to, of course, to understand the mechanisms that, and what it is that siblings share. When we find that out, then of course we can answer this question. I think this is very important to learn more about. So we need to study the part of the iceberg that is, I put it in the wrong way, below the water surface, I should probably say. And there's very little research about them. So what can be done in this field? Well, I think circumstance variables that have not been used so much. Grandparents, it's quite popular in these days to look at more than 2 generations. And some of those who do this are very excited about the results, and I think it's real progress to do that. But when I looked at the result from one study here, I looked at when you add grandparents to an intergenerational mobility equation, what happens to R squared? Almost nothing. So grandparents is not the answer to what is below the surface of the water in my way of looking at it. I have seen very little of the use of school and teacher quality, which I think is to be considered a circumstance. Non-cognitive skills, that has now been used by Marcus and his colleagues, and I'm happy about that. One can probably also use health indicators from early childhood, including birth weight. But still, I think it will be really difficult to solve it. But there are some ways one can go with it. And also explicit genetic information would fit very well into this. But the guys I have talked to who use explicit genetic information argue that each piece of information is so small that it's very difficult to use many of them and get a reasonable amount of explanatory power. So what are the prospects of coming close to sibling correlations? I think they are quite low. So my guess here is that very important circumstances are not only unobserved, they are also in practice unobservable. Because you have to figure out what it is in a family that is productive for the children during adulthood, and to really measure that in all respects, how parents can cooperate, values and so on, I think it's extremely difficult. So if it is that way, I think one must also look at indirect variance component approaches that I think are needed to find out more about this. So sibling correlations and MSET twin correlations capture the unobserved stuff, and I think that's a strength. But of course we want to learn what is it exactly. So time to sum up and conclude about the 4 approaches. Intergeneration mobility, that's rude. But so I think this is quite natural. It does not address the inequality opportunity question. And a lot of the papers that have been written here, I think, including some of my own, have started by motivating intergenerational mobility by inequality opportunity. But I think it's obvious that it cannot only be one variable that is a circumstance. It must be a lot of other things as well, and there's now a literature that addresses that. So I think that people in the intergenerational mobility literature should be more careful and actually give some nice references to the work that has been inspired by John Romer. But intergenerational mobility, I think, provides an easy to understand picture that the public policy debate seems to appreciate. One gets a picture of the degree of mobility and or the degree of transmission, and that seems to be something that we want. One can also put this in the following way. It tells us about the rise and fall of families. That's actually a subtitle to one of the Beckett-Thomas papers that are very famous in this field. I think this description is very much appreciated. So I think this is important. And the cross-country pattern has received a lot of public attention, and that shows that people find this striking. And maybe it's also easier to study and interpret country differences and trends in intergenerational mobility than in the combined importance of a set of circumstances. Take parental separation, for example. That probably meant something different 50 years ago than today, and can we then use it in trend analysis? I'm not really sure. It probably means something different in a Catholic country than in a country like ours. So I still think we need intergenerational mobility, but we should confess that inequality opportunity is something more and other variables. One variable cannot capture everything that deviates on equality opportunity model. Intergenerational effects, I think this approach addresses well-defined questions of high scientific and public policy importance. It's a clear question whether more or less resources to parents has impact. I think it's a direct policy question, so this is very important. But the estimated effects are small in the sense that they explain very little of inequality of income and schooling. But they might be large in other dimensions. So a benefit-cost ratio of some interventions that change parental income and education might be very high. So that might be. But sibling correlation, here I think I have a statement that some of you might dislike, because a sibling correlation does not provide the answer to a well-defined scientific or public policy question. It's rather a warning signal or a benchmark where the researchers have missed important family background factors. That's how I like to look at it. This signal is very strong, and that's why I think the results are so important, but it doesn't really, it has a statistical interpretation, but it's not the direct answer to a policy question. And I think the numbers are so high that all scholars with egalitarian attitudes should be concerned about them. So then we have equality opportunity. I think that finding the explanatory power of circumstances is the natural, correct approach to measuring inequality opportunity. So in this basic way, I think they are doing the right things here, or should I say we. But ideally, I think that a multivariate model of the circumstances causal effects is needed, and that's at least what one should strive for. And a multivariate model, of course, that's far from. Our profession is obsessed by causal effects, and we are very happy if we have a local treatment effect or a marginal treatment effect. Then we have, but a multivariate model of causal effect is really difficult. So I wouldn't say that it's a requirement that this field goes in that direction, because one has to be a bit pragmatic, but I think it's important to confess that causal effects of circumstances can be very different from the descriptive patterns that are mainly shown. Many important circumstances are not observed in typical data sets and are probably not observable even with very ambitious data collection efforts. So I think it's a very long way to go here. But maybe one can find the most important circumstances, but that should be done with a causal analysis. So final words here, I think we have learned that the family is important as a source of inequality. And in order to evaluate this result, we need to learn more about why. We need at least some hints about what is below the water surface. And I think some hints about that is more valuable than an even more detailed picture of what is above it. So I think this is the great challenge, what it is that siblings share, but that has nothing to do with parental resources. And because of that, of course, we need workshops like this where we learn more about these important topics.